I'll admit, the first time I saw the teaser for God of War, I was genuinely looking forward to it. To change the formula to a beloved, critically acclaimed series of games is a bold move, and what they were showing seemed pretty interesting to me, at first. The new setting, the style, the combat, I even didn't mind the change in voice actor. Change isn't necessarily a bad thing, but just because change isn't inherently bad doesn't mean it can't be bad. And the more and more I see, the more I dig, the worse and worse this game appears to me. It's all well and good when you show me a concept, a pre-scripted piece of cinema, but when you show me actual gameplay, that's when I sit up and notice, and from what I've seen, it doesn't look good to me. And I have my reasons, good reasons I think, that I thought I'd share. So to start off, I've noticed that the reboot of God of War actually hilariously shares a hell of a lot in common with the Darksiders franchise. So I've decided to use those games to help illustrate my points, and because I think it's really, really funny. So the first thing I'll talk about is the apparent new emphasis on story and world building, and like I said, I can appreciate change, but from what I've seen, this has gone way too far. The original games put the gameplay first, it pushed the story, not the other way around. And while obviously narratively driven games exist, they're usually paired up with gameplay that suits that style, usually survival horror or RPGs. Slow-paced games that can give you the opportunity to appreciate and pay attention to the storytelling. But this is an action game, with the emphasis on action. This is confused game design and is at odds with the gameplay. Everything we've seen up to this point has been pushing the narrative aspect of the game, which probably means that it's the best part of it, which I seriously doubt, but I'll get back to that. There's been a huge focus on the lore and story, almost an embarrassing amount, and honestly at this point it seems very, very self-indulgent. It's up to the point where I'm almost sure that the gameplay will suffer for it, because there's been way too much attention devoted to one aspect of the game over the others. Which leads me into the gameplay itself, with it being almost completely derivative of many other games, the most obvious one being Dark Souls. There's been an absolutely huge shift in the overall gameplay and tone from the previous games. The original God of War trilogy was an arcade-style aerial third-person hack-and-slash, and the reboot is a Dark Souls-style over-the-shoulder third-person hack-and-slash. Now, I won't go over all the differences in style because there are a lot, but the main one is the speed of gameplay. Because the combat in the first games were viewed from further back, usually from a fixed camera position, you had a better view of the stage area, which more often than not meant more enemies. A lot more enemies. But that was fine because you could see everything. This meant the combat could be more frantic and you had more things to dodge and attack, which in turn meant more things to kill. And this style of gameplay perfectly lined up with the tone they were going for, in that Kratos was an angry bastard and wanted to kill everything. That is incredibly thoughtful game design with narrative and gameplay integration. The God of War reboot, however, seems conflicted. Kratos is apparently trying to suppress his anger and hatred, but is as brutal as ever. In fact, on multiple occasions, I've seen the developers talk about how they wanted to make it more brutal. And this is at odds with the narrative, so which is it? So right away, the tone is completely off. Now, as for the main gameplay, it's a Dark Souls clone, and they basically outright admit it.
We don't want to just mimic Dark Souls as much as we like that game.
Now, what bothers me about this is I haven't seen a single instance of thoughtful or deep combat, no matter how much they like to harp on the contrary. Every instance of combat looks boring and uninvolving. The AI especially looks like it's asleep most times, and Kratos can dispatch enemies with outright ease. Because of the change in style, there's less to fight, and when there are more enemies, they curiously stay out of combat or stay dazed for long enough for you to have a one-on-one honourable duel, but without the challenge of Dark Souls. So in other words, they've copied the Dark Souls gameplay, but not the formula that makes it work. okay. Next, I'll quickly talk about the inventory, gear, skill tree, and no doubt quest system that they've put into place. It's too much. The reason God of War was such a great game, well loved by everyone and critically acclaimed, was because it kept everything simple. The new God of War is unfocused, and it's clearly trying to incorporate as many trendy gameplay elements as possible, the Dark Souls gameplay being one of them. It's putting all its eggs in one basket, which probably means that each element is going to be subpar. Quantity over quality. Mainstream market appeal comes first, apparently. And everything I've mentioned so far amazingly lines up with Darksiders and Darksiders 2. The original was a combat and gameplay driven game with narrative elements to help push more gameplay, and characters were only usually introduced when the gameplay demanded some new ability or power to help you progress further in the game. But in Darksiders 2, they added a bunch of extra elements as well as a deeper integrated story that only held it back and bogged it down in the end. Another case of self-indulgent storytelling with tons of additional unneeded features. A quest system, an open but not too open world map, the inclusion of weapons, gear, armour and shops, quirky characters with a hell of a lot of extra dialogue, with Mass Effect style radial options of course. And all of this was set to the backdrop of Norse mythology. And while we're here, why not talk about the axe? Because they just can't shut up about it. The axe can be thrown and then it magically comes back to you when you call it. Kinda like in Mario Odyssey. Oh yeah, I'm comparing it to Darksiders. Kinda like in Darksiders. The crossblade glaive. You throw it, it sticks in things, you can call it back and it hits stuff on its return journey. The only surprise is that this particular weapon didn't even come back for the sequel, which is doubly funny since God of War does seem to be following in its footsteps. And Darksiders 2 was a much inferior game compared to the first, and it wasn't as well received, so go figure. I'm not saying the added story elements were really horrible or anything. It did stay true to the original style for the most part, but it was incredibly slow and tedious in a game that shouldn't have had those elements in the first place. Which brings me to my next problem with God of War. The story itself, or more specifically the writing staff. Okay, specifically Cory Barlog. I've got to say, if anything's going to sink this game, it's him. And this is where I get the whole self-indulgent thing from. The amount of work he's put into the story is admirable, but I would say almost completely unnecessary. And I don't want to attack the guy too much, but I'm really not confident in his writing abilities or abilities to make games in general. It seems like he's more interested in making movies to me, and if you read his earlier interviews, that's pretty much exactly what he says. We'll probably never know the real reason for his departure directing God of War 3, but if I had to guess, I'd say creative differences with massive air quotes. Honestly, the game looks okay, just okay. Middle of the road, dime a dozen, a grim dark no surprises plot of a game lumped into a generic hack and slash Dark Souls combat system with Skyrim-esque RPG elements tacked on. And the funny thing is, people defend these new changes from the God of War formula because of franchise fatigue, like seriously? The irony there is so strong and stunning it could knock you to the moon. You know, hopefully I'm wrong, but from everything I've seen so far, I really don't have high hopes for it. But I guess we'll find out soon enough, won't we?